We've been talking in this class about a lot of different problems and some of the solutions to those problems, but I feel like this chapter does a fairly good job of connecting like how change actually happens. I remember when I was in college wanting to see a lot of change and talking to instructors about how do you make those changes, and they were always uh, they took longer than I wanted them to, but there was a process, uh, and it often kind of goes a certain way. Like it doesn't just kind of like pop out of the blue in which change happens. Typically, some steps that are usually followed in order to make big changes. So yeah, this chapter is called Social Problems and Social Action, kind of connecting those two parts together. So let's talk about understanding a social movement. A social movement is the act of bringing that change that people are looking for. A conscious, collective means it's a group effort. It's on purpose. That's what conscious means. An organized attempt to bring about or resist large-scale change to the social order. And so I guess I could just be maintaining what used to be, or changing what is, or trying to, into something different in the future. So that's what a social movement is. And there are two ways that they categorize or classify social movements. One is who is going to be affected by this change. Is it a small group of people or is it the entire society? Right? And how much change is going to happen? Is it going to be a small amount of change? Maybe it's going to be a small amount of change for the entire society. Or maybe it's going to be it's going to affect only a small number of people, but it's going to be a radical change for those people. So gay marriage would be an example of this. That would be, it really impacts a fairly small number of people directly, but it would be a radical change for those small groups of people. Whereas, say, if they ban cell phones and driving in the entire United States, that would be a relatively small change for a very large number of people. All right, understanding social movements. So there's different types of social movements. Realize that there's a little bit of overlap between these. So a reform movement would be about trying to bring about a limited social change by working within the existing system. So maybe you work in a school system and you want to see things differently. Then that would be a reform movement. The word reform reminds me of the Reformation. The Reformation being the movement within the Catholic Church that was started by Martin Luther. The Reformation, right? Now that was he was trying to work within that system. Obviously, he ended up breaking off from that system, or maybe they broke him off. I'm not sure, but anyway, it's about you're trying to stay within that system. You're not trying to start your own system. Revolutionary social movements. For this, you're seeking fundamental changes to the system itself. So again, kind of sticking with the wording here, a revolution. We had our own revolution in the United States, right? We used to be a colony of Britain, and then we declared independence. That was a revolution. That is a changing of the system itself, away from the British Empire into independence, right? The whole system got changed. And instrumental movements seeks to change the structure of society, such as civil rights and the environmental movement, right? Civil rights, how is that you're changing the structure of society? Well, previous to the civil rights, you had a hierarchy within society where you had people of color beneath people who were white, right? So you're trying to change that system. The environmental movement says we need to move away from a system that is dependent on fossil fuel and that is using lots of resources as if there's an unlimited supply. So if you're going to change that, that's going to be a pretty radical change, you know, away from those things that we've gotten really used to. An expressive movement attempts to change individuals or individual behavior. I think of this as being maybe a style. You know, you're trying to get people to say, stop wearing clothing made out of animals or something like that. You're trying to change individual behavior, not really attacking the systems that maybe, say, produce the clothes. All right. Understanding social movements. NSM is a theory that says that the recent social movements are different from those in the past. These new social movements have a different ideology than ones in the past. And one of those is that there's a distrust of formal organizations, such as the church. If you think about the civil rights movement, specifically the black church was very instrumental in helping that cause, but that's a formal organization. And if the new social movements are against formal organizations, then they're going to be at least getting away from the old ones. Maybe they're going to create new ones, but they're going to be less formal, you know, less this person is in charge and they answer this person and these people are in and these people are out. It's much more like free flowing, maybe controlled with social media. This is where we're meeting up, this is what we're doing, without the structure and the rules and the formalities that would have been associated with those formal organizations. And oftentimes the people who are doing this are younger people. It's usually younger people that are involved in social movements, not always. And they are from the middle class, and they have a lot of connections with a lot of mostly other young people. All right, how do social movements begin? I have found myself wishing, especially when I was young, it seems as though when you're younger, you're a little bit more idealistic and you have a little bit more belief and hope that the system's going to change, hopefully by tomorrow, and being frustrated that that wasn't happening. Hang on one second. Right. I don't know if you were picking up that sound or not, but I wanted to eliminate it mostly. All right. Social movements do not generally arise from a stable social context. Rather, they arise from a changing social order. So if you think about things that are happening right before big social movements occur, there's generally something seemingly unrelated. You know, going back to Martin Luther, the printing press was the changing social context in that situation. There were some social movements out of the Middle East about 10 years ago, and that was really because the social context was changing due to the smartphones and the internet. And so oftentimes there is something that's kind of changing, that's kind of causing everybody to look at things differently. There were a lot of protests and a lot of political action in 2020 and 21, and you could argue that was because we weren't in a stable social context. It was during a pandemic. All right. It arises from the structure itself, which means that it's not an act of individual will. There's something going on in the structure that is causing some people to not get their due. They're deprived. There's some sort of social or economic deprivation. They're not allowed to participate fully in social society. They're not allowed to make an income, or they're not making an income that is sufficient. Right? One of the things to realize is that just because people are poor does not mean that they are going to change things. And the thought here is that if you have a group of people and everyone's poor, then nobody's really going to think anything's weird or strange or necessarily needs to change, or at least you're not going to change the structure, I guess. But when some people have so much more than some other people, then it's a comparative thing. It's a relative, like, wait a minute, why do you have so much and these people over here have so little? And so it's like, as a species, we don't do very well when some people have more than others. And I know you can say that some people are just amazing, and that's why why they have so much more than the rest of us. And okay, but I can just tell you that if you think about children, and one child has 3 toys and the other one has 1 toy, this is not going to go over well, right? Unless the one with 3 toys or someone else in the environment, it has a really heavy hand over the child that only has 1. Because it's not about only having 1 toy. If both children only had 1 toy, then there wouldn't be any deprivation, any relative deprivation. And if both children had 3 toys, it's just about, why does someone have so much more than the other person? That's oftentimes where social movements begin there. All right. Typically, there are structural conditions that are necessary for the development of the collective behavior and the social movements. There's something going on that's going to cause people to work together, because the social movement is not about an individual. They may be an individual leader, but it's not an individual doing it by themselves. There has to be something that kind of causes people to come together as a group. Particular structures are more likely to generate certain kinds of social movements than others. Our book mentions racial divides, such as in the United States, is more likely to start a social movement. And then people become dissatisfied with the current structure only if the structure is perceived as oppressive or illegitimate. It's only if people believe that the structure has something wrong with it. Oftentimes what happens when you have a structure where you have some people that have so much more than others, there's a heavy ideology, a heavy system of belief that justifies that difference, where people believe, oh yes, I may have very, very little, but that's because the people who have so much more are so different from me. They're smarter, they're harder working, they're closer to God, there's something about them. That is why they have so much more. And if the society buys that, if they believe that, then there's no social movement's going to happen. It's only when the structure is perceived as illegitimate, this is not true, this is not just, this is harmful, then we have a situation where a social movement can begin. There must be a growth of a generalized belief system. It may start with one person who is saying this system is illegitimate, it's not fair, but it's got to grow and it's got to appeal to and make sense to a large number of people. Oftentimes dramatic events sharpen or concretize, I didn't know that was a word, the issue. A great example is the pandemic, right? That's a dramatic event. Everybody's stuck at home with little to do, feeling alone, feeling isolated, watching Netflix and reading about QAnon, and you have a situation where a social movement is ripe to begin. Movements gain momentum with the mobilization of leaders and members. Forces in society respond to the social movement either by accepting or suppressing them. What is the media doing with these movements? What are the politicians saying about these movements? What's the religious community saying about these movements? And so they have the act of either accepting them and potentially adding energy to them and resources, or suppressing them, saying no, that's not an accurate picture of what's going on. That's not what we want to be involved with. So, all right. Oftentimes there is a period of time when you have to gather resources in order to allow the social movement to begin. And I oftentimes think of money, but that's really probably not the most valuable thing, because there are a lot of rich people in the United States that would like a lot of things changed, but they're not necessarily happening because they lack the people, they lack the passion, the things we just mentioned, actually, right? And so the things you need leadership. You need somebody who is charismatic, who is standing up saying, I am going to lead this thing, follow me, I'm going to bring us somewhere better, we're going to change things. You need knowledge of how to make those changes, as well as an organizational infrastructure to support its work. You're going to need a website. You're going to need volunteers to help people understand how they can be involved in this. A political process model emphasizes the relationship between a mobilized social movement and a favorable structure of political opportunities. There are politicians that are typically not in a position of great power, and so they are needing something to push them into the spotlight. Maybe they're in power, but they're worried about losing power. And so there are some politicians who are going to grab a hold of a social movement and say, I want to be a part of this. This is something that I can get behind, and I will, all I can think of is put it on blast. They're going to take the message and they are going to spread it from the platform that they have. Oftentimes politicians are invited onto news stations and they're interviewed on the radio, and so that is sort of that marrying of the social movement and the politicians, which is the current power structure. Right? How have reform movements made a difference? So early in human history, most social change was a result of trial and error. Let's say all the men go off hunting or to war, and the women stay home and all the men get killed. And so you're going to have a situation where the traditional leaders in a patriarchal society, the men, have all died. And so you have to have somebody in charge, or that's the belief. And so a woman steps into that. So that would be an example of trial and error that would have brought about a social change. If they do a good job, then maybe the belief systems about who should be in charge begins to change. That's what happened in the United States during World War II. Many women were working in the factories, and when the men came back, the women were encouraged to go back home, and many of them did, but many of them stayed, and many of them that went back home ended up not staying home and coming back. Why? Because we tried women working and it worked well, and so we kept doing it. Majority of social movements are reform movements, which focus on either broad or narrow social reforms. The majority of social movements that have occurred in history are pretty small. We're not rebuilding society. It's just changing several things, changing who's responsible for poor people, for instance, and who decides who gets to get married, things like that. They produce significant change, but in gradual or piecemeal ways, a little bit here, a little bit there, until you have a change over a longer period. All right, the most important reform movements early in the 20th century, so early 1900s, focused on grievances related to social class. This was factory laborers who were oftentimes unionized, and they were saying it's not okay that the working man, which is your blue-collar factory worker, is starving while his fat cat boss, who's upper class, is making all this money, right? So that would be a reform movement in the early 1900s. After World War II, so the second half of the 20th century, we saw a new type of movement, including civil rights movement, student movement, feminist, gay liberation, ethnic and racial movements, which addressed inequalities based on social statuses other than social class. So they're not social class based. They're gender based. They're sexual identity based. It's race based, ethnic based, right? Age based. Successful reform movements generate change by changing the culture of society. And they do this through educating people and helping people see the world in a different light. They change people's beliefs about whatever the group is about. Maybe it's about women, changing the beliefs about women or children. And then if the beliefs change, oftentimes the behaviors will follow after that as well. Oftentimes there are new organizations or institutions that are needed to be created that are going to continue to have an influence on the structure. So our book mentions, several institutions like the Women's Equity Action League, National Women's Political Caucus, and what these do is they organize and educate society about issues that are related to women. How else have reform movements made a difference? Well, one of the more lasting changes comes through policy, comes through law. And if a movement can create a partnership with the people who are in governmental power and have them put into policy, legislation, even just a norm, like we're creating a new way of doing things. It may not even be written down, but it's just kind of what we're, a new normal for us. These can have really successful, lasting changes and ripples throughout society. How do you make a lasting connection? How do you do something that actually works? I think realizing that social problems are complex, they're there. The current situation is there for a reason. It may be a bad reason, but it is there for some reason. And so not being naive about how easy it would be to change, or the fact that everybody won't necessarily support what you're trying to do. Right? There are oftentimes larger social forces at play that are supporting the current system, whatever it is. There's oftentimes someone who's benefiting or someone who believes that it should remain the way that it is. And so anything that you can do to understand that person's perspective, that's going to really help you in that. Social movements begin with an individual effort. Somebody decides to try to make a change. That alone won't be sufficient, but it is the first step in that. A grassroots organization. A grassroots is the idea that it's the people from within the communities that are being affected, not somebody from outside of the community. But if you have a group of people within the community and they have strong connection to their community, they know other people, they know their neighbors trust them, that's really helpful. And having a local leader, someone that people can say, oh, I know that person, I trust that person, I'll get behind and support that person. Students have a pretty significant voice in the culture. In our society, we're a youth-based culture. We look up to people who are younger and look down on people who are older. Oftentimes youth are looked at as being innocent and having a lot of passion, and so student voices, they can lead to a significant change in the way that the country believes and acts on various things. In 2016, 30% of UCLA college freshmen, UCLA is the University of California, Los Angeles. It's a pretty famous university, and so 30% of their college freshmen said that they wanted to influence the political structure. That was very important or essential to them. And so when I first read this, I was thinking that's not very high. I thought it would be higher because UCLA is kind of a famous place where you have a lot of really capable people and a lot of tomorrow's leaders going there. And so, all right, but that's them. 43% of students feel it is important to become a community leader. That's great. That's much higher than the previous statistic because it requires leadership. And I oftentimes think of it as we don't need amazing leaders. We need leaders that are reasonable and are willing to do the hard work. A lot of times people will say, I can't do this because I'm not that kind of a person. Right? And I think that's probably not true. You are that person, or you would be that person if you decided to step up and to do that. I don't necessarily think of myself as a community leader either, but if all it would take was me trying, and then I would probably learn and change and become that picture of whatever I think a community leader is supposed to be. 51% of people have spoke up publicly about a cause, and 22% have demonstrated for a cause. That's actually a lot more people than the average population. All right, recognize that you can make a difference. You don't have to change the world to solve a social problem. You can start small and local. Maybe you can just influence 3 or 4 people, but maybe you can influence somebody that can influence 40 people. And one of those 40 people that they influence is somebody that can influence 4 million people. So a lot of times it just starts out with somebody who's small, who can just talk to a few people about an issue. Explore opportunities for service on your campus and your community. It is easier to talk about the things that are wrong in the world, in society, on campus. It is a whole nother deal to actually explore ways to change that, right? Because that requires a lot more effort, a lot more relationship building, but that's ultimately how things change. And so I think that's something that you should do if that is something that you are interested. If you're interested in seeing change, then there are things that you can do in your community, on your campus. Do what you enjoy doing. When you know what you like, when you know what you can contribute, you will find the right connection. Maybe you're somebody that says, I have a hard time talking to people, but I can make a picture. I can make a video of somebody else talking. Well, that's great because you actually don't need that many leaders. A lot of times leaders just need people who can support them. Go out and do it. You don't need a lifelong commitment. But change doesn't happen automatically. It begins with individual action. So with that, I'm signing off.